Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me in the back? No one's ever said they can't hear me. Well, hello and welcome to the HIMSS17 User Experience Forum. The theme for this year's forum is demanding delightful healthcare user experiences. We believe patients deserve an empathetic experience, consuming healthcare both at their best and most vulnerable times. We believe that care teams deserve to be able to focus their fullest energies on providing guidance and healing for their patients with intuitive technology that seamlessly integrates into their optimal workflows. And we believe that as a nation, we deserve a healthcare system that incorporates the best practices from other complex, high-risk industries and eagerly works to improve the experience and quality of care while reducing overall costs. I'm Eric Raffin, Chief Information Officer at the San Mateo County Health System and member of the HIMSS Health IT User Experience Committee, and I'll be acting as your moderator this morning. During our opening keynote panel, we will define what the healthcare industry can learn from effective user experience strategies used in other industries, share user experience tactics that can be immediately acted upon no matter your size or resources, and identify the value user experience drives for healthcare organizations. Here are some statistics that speak to why user experience is so important for healthcare to get right. I'll let you indulge in those for a moment. And then I'll ask you just one quick question. Has anyone in the room used a ride-share service in the last week or so? Just raise your hand. Okay, that's like 3/4 of the room at least. So that was an experience. It was probably intuitive. There was interoperability to your calendar, to your GPS, to your thumb for payment. You got to have a fun time watching the car approach where you were. And the last experience I had yesterday, when I got out of the car, I find myself smiling when I thanked the driver for the ride. And so for me, that was about as close to a delightful user experience as I've had in a long time with an information system. And that leads us to our esteemed panelists this morning. We're very excited to bring you 3 thought leaders in user experience and design to share their insights with you today. Kyra Baumanet, MD, MPH, is Chief Executive Officer of Engaged In, a neuroscience behavior design firm. Kyra is also author of Well-Designed Life, 10 Lessons in Brain Science and Design Thinking for a Mindful, Healthy, and Purposeful Life. Lorraine Chapman is Senior Director, Healthcare at Macadamian Technologies, a UX and software development firm. Lorraine was the chairperson of the 2015-16 HIT User Experience Committee here at HIMSS. And finally, Rick Starbuck. Rick is Senior Vice President, Product and Experience Design at Change Healthcare. Prior to his work with Change Healthcare, Rick held senior user experience positions in the financial and web design industries. Please join me in giving Kyra, Lorraine, and Rick a warm welcome. Okay, so as far as format for our forum this morning, we've got 3 areas we're going to discuss. First, what is user experience's connection to value? Then, how do other industries leverage user experience? And then finally, how do thought leaders in the healthcare industry leverage user experience? As we go through each of those 3 sections, we'll take about 15 minutes a pop. If you have questions for the panelists, please go ahead and queue up along the center aisle near the microphones, and we'll pause between moving between the 3 topics to field some of your questions. If we go a little over, you may see me push us along because I want to make sure that we get to all 3 areas. But with that, let's dive in. And I think I'll dive in first right here. Kyra, you're closest to me. How does a focus on user experience drive value for an organization? And what type of value does it create?
So I think there's 2 kind of sides of the fence. So one of them is just to not piss people off. And we have a really hard time with that in healthcare. And then the other side is this kind of, holy grail that we're talking about today, which is delight. And I think delight is broken down into kind of emotional categories, because if somebody is in a really distressed state, like oftentimes in healthcare, that's what distinguishes our field from like Snapchat, which can delight you, all day, every day, and be your boredom tool, versus if you're kind of calm, or if it's a preventive case, or if it's a fitness use case or something like that, you have different emotions to work. So I think that the value is, from my perspective, looking at the brain all the time, is to create a experience in the brain that both is memorable, hippocampal area, and amygdala emotion, and dopamine and oxytocin are like these hormones that kind of cement it all in. And so you're kind of grouting in this experience so that when there's a brand recognition, or when there's an approach again, that there's a willingness or even anticipation of either you're going to relieve my pain, or you're going to make me happy. You're going to show compassion, something like that. So I think all those things, kind of drive to, in the user's subconscious, what the value is, and it leaves this kind of artifact of good feeling.
I completely agree. I was also going to say, from the business perspective, I think there's also sort of two angles to it. One is that user side, which is, if you're in business, you're probably in business to, with your customers, to provide some kind of value to them, to solve problems for them, whether you have a service business or a product business, or a combination of the two. And so really getting close to, hey, what do these people really, as your customers, as your users, what do they value? What is it that you can do to solve problems for them is tied up directly with the ways that we measure keeping customers, growing business, et cetera. And on the cost side, if you think about UX as a way to look at what's most valuable, it makes a lot of sense to only spend time working on the things that are going to be the most valuable to your customers, right? A lot of us develop features and products that we thought were great in the boardroom or in the conference room, but when they hit the market, they sort of fizzle. And so I think understanding before you hit the market what might happen in terms of attachment to value by your customers is a key part of really cost optimization as well.
So really, they've left nothing for me to say, except that's what we're talking about, the value that's realized on the user side. So that's through emotion, behavior. So user experience can help build trust, give a sense of security, and just be appealing in many different ways depending on the situation. And then on the business side, what is the ROI? And I think that for any kind of business or organization, user experience is a differentiator. It's almost actually, an expectation now. Healthcare is late to the game, I think, in terms of user experience, but it definitely has that ROI. I mean, we used to talk about how, $100 spent up front in the product development phase would the cost of fixing issues after it's been released doubles, if not triples. And I think that's still the case now. So user experience becomes that differentiator from not just externally, but internally to the organization in terms of saving themselves from wasted product development cycles, and just ensuring at the end of the day that what you're building is actually meeting a need, either for your customer, the purchaser or buyer, or for the target end user.
So one of the things I think, I've kind of realized as epiphany is we don't have a framework of how to think about design and how to think about experience design in specific. And it came to me that really everything fits into the bucket of love or fear. You're either loving somebody and they're feeling it and it's captured, and that's compassion, empathy, the right words at the right time, the right caring person, an emotional match to, if you're really, really sad, you don't have some bouncy character trying to gamify your experience or something like that. And then fear, it's terrifying to be in healthcare and to face, as a doctor, sitting with people who are dying, and many of you probably have loved ones that are dying, and maybe you are also doctors. There's an intensity there. It's the essence of our existence that's at stake. And so it's a very different sort of algorithm of how to know where you're at on the map and how to match that emotion that's happening, as well as predict the emotion that's happening. Because most of what is amiss in experience design, especially as we lean more on technology, is that we're missing, because we're blinded to the facial expressions, we're blinded to the sort of moment-to-moment emotions of the person that we're trying to reach. And so we're kind of this, Aspergian, reaching, insensitive technology. But remember that the brain hasn't evolved to have a different category for, oh, I'm dealing with a chatbot, or oh, I'm dealing with an app. It still applies the same expectations of human relationships, which is called anthropomorphization, onto these technologies. And so I think that, to me, it's very superficial right now, but we have to drop down a level and say, okay, if I'm going to drive value, I have to really nail this emotional design aspect of it.
Thank you very much. Rick, maybe we'll go to you next. Why does good design just feel right? What's the science behind that? What can you share with us?
I'm sitting next to a neuroscientist, so I'm going to try to answer this as carefully as I possibly can. It feels right because a lot of times, for two reasons I would say. One is we're leveraging what you already know, right? Great design looks at the user's mental model, we would call it, which is really just the sum total of all your experiences and beliefs and expectations about the world. And we try to use that as much as we can. Sometimes we use that in a really specific way, what they call skeuomorphism, which is, literally having a trash can on your desktop to throw something away as an icon, referencing the physical world. But a lot of times it's really just looking at cognitive science and understanding how the brain works, what's already in that brain, and how do we leverage that. So we don't have to teach you something new. We can actually try to reference something, even if it's subtle, that you already know, and that makes it feel like less of an incline for you as a user or a customer in order to use that product. So yeah, I think I'll stop there.
I like to liken it to dating, actually, because if anybody's gone through the dating process, it feels wrong until it feels right, right? And there is science behind that. So we all have, and I like to make this analogy with design because we all have certain checklists, right? Meaningful use gives us a checklist of things that we have to include in the EMR or the patient portal. And so on paper, that might look good, but in implementation, it just doesn't feel right. And that's often because you are missing the framework behind it. And I would argue we do have a framework for designing good experience. We have a human-centered design approach. Everybody just needs to start implementing it in its truest form, start using the design thinking framework to ensure that you're not just taking words on a page and saying, okay, we're going to take this list of features and plunk it here. You're actually putting the user and a variety of different stakeholders at the center of that framework and designing specifically to their emotional needs, to their workflows, to their mental models, and taking all of that into account when you inform and use that to inform the design process.
Did you have anything you wanted to add, Kyra?
Well, I feel like for me, where I'm at in my journey is that, coming from medicine, which got it totally wrong, and then going to public health and large-scale design for a payer, and some things went right. I was hungry for what's the missing piece. And I feel like, and I'm totally biased here, but I feel like where I arrived at was behavior design with B.J. Fogg at Stanford, and then beyond that is neuroscience-based design, because I felt like even with human-centered design tactics, and if it was just about that, then IDEO would have fixed everything by now, So I do think it's a powerful tool. I do think it's absolutely utilized and under-scaled, to your point. I want everybody to do it. So maybe it's just an adoption curve issue where that's the next wave, and then we get to this brain science stuff. And just having a way to more accessibly, because when it's kind of like a field biologist. If they know where the creature is and what their habits are and where they go and what their behaviors are and what their tracks look like and everything else, they can be more effective at studying them, right? And so I think of that as the brain. Like, when you know where the brain's going to go, it's going to zig or zag, or it's going to shut down. You don't have to spend so much time with guessing or iterating for 40 miles out is my analogy there. So I just feel like we need to really, and this is my hope for the entire field, is to really have applied sciences, and I think that's why you see this burgeoning of behavioral science, neuroscience, whatever, along with design thinking kind of and I think it's just like, mix it together, peanut butter and jelly, like put them together, folks, because one without the other doesn't do the trick. It doesn't.
Absolutely agree. Yeah, research is, ethnographic research, behavioral research is an integral part, I think, of the human-centered design process. It has to be.
And I think it's one of the things that's most often neglected, right? Is when I consult with people on design, most often they're focused on the solution side, right? They know what they can deliver. They know the features. They know the capabilities. They're expert. Inside baseball experts on their own solutions, right? What they don't know a lot about a lot of time are their customers and what they really need, and sometimes like to a woeful degree, right? So if you think about any of these HCD or human-centered design frameworks, I think they all break down into needs, solutions, and validation, validating that you're getting it right between those two things. And what I find is a lot of companies focus in the middle on solutions, and they kind of miss the needs and the validation part.
Great, thank you. I think I'll open this up to whoever wants to dive in first. What are some examples of organizations that excel financially because of their understanding of great user experiences?
Sure. So one thing, I actually jotted down just a little stat because my brain can't retain numbers. One thing that I uncovered in just doing some quick little research is that design-centric companies outperform the S&P 500 by 211% since 2015. So for anybody questioning the value of user experience, I think they should stop questioning it and get on board. Now, this is coming from somebody who's been doing user experience for 20 years when, user experience, talking to people about it, it actually wasn't even called user experience, it was called usability. It was like banging your head against a brick wall, right? And definitely that has changed significantly, and we can see that in that quote, that stat that I just quoted. I think in the consumer side or outside of healthcare, there are a ton of examples. We're in Orlando. So what's the first example that comes to mind in terms of a great user experience? And that's Disney World. And I think the companies that do exceptionally well are the ones that think about the entire experience. So not just about this app that I might be having an interaction with, but about the environment in which I'm using that application. It could be customer support. It could be the physical experience I have with the organization. And so taking everything, looking at the entire ecosystem and designing that ecosystem and not just designing points on a map. And I think if you just think about those points individually, that's where you get into trouble because there's no connection. So if you think about even in healthcare, we have a lot of issues when it comes to continuum of care and designing for that continuum of care because most companies and people are taking a look at it at points in time rather than taking a look at the end-to-end experience. I think we can learn a lot from the consumer world or just non-traditional, non-traditional digital world as well. So a company that I like is Alessi. You can look it up. It's an Italian company, and they design products. But they actually have a team dedicated to understanding what the emotional desires are of their target audience and design that into their product, the individual product, but also the product experience. So how people would come and experience the website, for instance, if they're if they're purchasing it online. So they really are tying it in. That's a traditional product design world, but not traditionally digital, right? And so they've extended it beyond that immediate border.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that these companies do is that they're design forward in the sense that they don't start from their own constraints. They don't start from the ingredients they've got in the refrigerator left over from dinner last night in terms of figuring out what dish they're going to serve, right? They start with, hey, what experience do I want to create? And then how do I source that, right? And you look at Apple. Apple is sort of the poster child both in terms of valuation and customer experience in many ways. They go out and buy glass companies when they need new glass, or they invent a new kind of glass when they need that experience. So they're designed forward. They're starting with the experience they want and that they've determined that they need to deliver to their customers. And they're letting themselves be pulled forward into that, as opposed to the other way around and being pushed by their existing constraints.
Okay. I just want to take a quick pause. That's our first of 3 topic areas. If anyone's got questions, now would be a great time to run out to the mic.
I think I would love for everybody to kind of come up to the mic and kind of make this interactive, because you're in charge of your experience of this panel. And so if you come out of here bored, it's your fault.
Fire away.
Okay.
We're not blaming the user, though.
Yes, not blaming the user. You're the designers.
If you were to build a UX team at a healthcare company that didn't have one, what job functions and skill sets would you bring on first?
I have a strong opinion about that. I think behavior design is the new wave of design. It's the sort of third leg of the stool. If you see things like Oscar nail, UI, nail UX, but then the BX, because of the complexity of the industry that they're in, you need to know the behavioral layer and where the sort of collective and also individual brain. And it's not enough to just do market research. It's not enough just to do segmentation or personas. You have to have the science basis to start with, because if we knew what we knew in science and then we're able to import that into design, I think that's, to me, that's the missing piece of a lot of design teams that we see.
So we get this question all the time, because everybody goes, I have to start somewhere. And so if it was just one person, and they're looking for the unicorn. And I'm sorry, there is no design unicorn. So I actually, because I work for a consulting company, I come back to the client and say, actually, you need to hire 2 people minimum. You need somebody with the appropriate design skills and understands behavior, but somebody who can do the interaction and hopefully the visual design. That's kind of a unicorn even on its own, because it's really hard to get an interaction designer who's really good at visual design and vice versa. But if you have somebody with the design skills that you can then pair with a behavioral scientist or an ethnographic researcher, then those bare minimum are the 2, because what we've been talking about is what's wrong in healthcare today is that you're not getting the foundational understanding to use to inform the design. And so if you can have 2 people that can work in pairs, they work in tandem, they work together, the designer can learn from what the researcher is uncovering, and vice versa. The researcher can work with the designer to ensure that, you're translating that information into an appropriate architecture, into an appropriate navigational structure. So I'd say, forget the one person, go with 2 with those combination of skills.
And I actually did this recently because I'm building a team out, or have been building a team out, and I would start with the research. I would start with somebody who understands how to get close to customers in a rigorous methodological way, right? Whether that's behavior science or design thinking or whatever. You need somebody who's not just going to go, make a pretty persona document, but really understand how to develop an understanding. I think of it, if anybody knows skyscraper building, right? They have to go down to go up. They dig in the ground until they hit bedrock, right? That's what they attach the foundation to. So it feels like it's not moving very fast, but once that bedrock gets connected to the foundation, then it goes up really fast. And it's similar, I think, with this kind of design. So you have to be careful that the sort of illusion of speed, that moving in any direction is good. Moving in the direction that is going to get you the right product is good. Moving in every other direction quickly is just getting to the wrong place faster.
Well, I like that you said foundation, Rick, because I feel like, I see that the biggest problem is that we think form factor before we think, what's needed here. And one of the most mind-blowing things for me, coming out of a big company and creating, billion-dollar products, and, coming into Stanford with BJ Fogg's lab, is he did the lowest fidelity thing you could possibly do for the shortest amount of time. He's a real minimalist, right? So to me, it kind of reverse flowed what I was expecting, which is that you can just use an SMS, kind of dirty tool and just text a bunch of people and see, or post a bunch of pictures, or share, use the existing technology. You don't need a designer for a very long time, like in the classic sense, right? And conversely, when people start with design, they've already made assumptions that then becomes this blind spot of you can't go back. You can't find what you didn't know. Like you can't know what you didn't know because you already assumed, and you can't see that you already assumed. So it's just that's where I think the biggest airspace is in our industry, is having an assumption that you don't see you're making.
Thank you.
Hi. You gave a great example about the Disney. They clearly define who is the target market or target user is, but in healthcare, it's a big challenge. Who is the user really? Is it the patients, or is it the patient family, or is it the physicians, or is it the administrators? Can you please expand on that?
It's all of the above. And so, yeah, healthcare is a complex environment. But part of doing the appropriate, starting with the research to really identify for your particular space, for your particular product, who those target users are. And it's typically not just, you can't even say the patient, because you can dissect even that target audience in so many different ways. So, are you creating an oncology patient portal? Are you, doing a generic patient portal that supports, chronic and acute patients? It's actually, you wouldn't even think of yourself as a patient, right? I'm not a patient right now, but I use my doctor's patient portal. And so it really is all of the above. So what you need to do is identify who those start with the primary stakeholders, do the necessary research to understand what are their goals, what are their motivations, what are the emotions that they're experiencing, what's their past experience with regards to either the industry or specific tools, whatever is, what's in their ecosystem, making sure you have a good understanding of that. And before you dive into, okay, so what are the usage scenarios and tasks associated to that? So you're not just going to have one persona and therefore only design to one persona. You're going to have to dissect it in many different ways to understand, okay, this, my product, a hospital administrator may not be the primary user of the product, but they're going to use the output, right? They're interested in understanding how is this product improving outcomes, for instance. And so for them, you want to key in on specific reports, for instance, generating insights that are going to help them build either a business case for something else or prove that, okay, our processes that we currently have in-house are actually improving outcomes, or they're not, and what can I do to improve that? That could just be one small element of your product. Meanwhile, the real user is the nurse, right? So it's really just doing the appropriate research to understand who are those target personas, and making sure you understand what their specific goals and needs are.
And look at all the players in that map, right? When you begin that, we sometimes call journey mapping, right? We look at, even if you think you have one user as your target, there are a lot of people in that community that they interact with, right, either directly or indirectly. So I think mapping all of that and kind of having a wider lens when you start, even if you think that that's wider than the scope of what your product is supposed to be, or the space that you've been told to work in, or that you have to work in, I would widen that scope. Because think about Disney as an example, right? Yes, the family entertainment and the family of 2.5 kids is their audience, but they also design their cast member experience, their employee experience, right? They can't possibly create something that feels so holistic and so connected if they only focus on what they think is the real end user, right? They're looking at an entire ecosystem of users. And it could be daunting, right? But starting there, having a wide lens, understanding how to then decide where to put your focus with the context of those other users in mind is very, very powerful.
Go ahead.
So we all understand that lots of times people want to jump directly to the solutions. And that is oftentimes the result of us being in organizations that are maybe fighting fires or what have you. Moving towards the mindset of design thinking requires a change in culture. So what I'd like to know is that as consultants and as people out there in the world, what have you seen or what have you prescribed to your customers or organizations to begin to change that mindset? Because oftentimes people are like, you just start and come back to me in 90 days with what do you think the problem is, as opposed to getting them accustomed to sit down and go, hey, here's a prototype. Let's start talking about it. It's a big change for a lot of organizations, and I'd like some examples of how you've led organizations to change that mindset.
So bad news is I think you have to work in the off hours to get yourself some slow brain time in order to change anything. These large organizations are afflicted with either a meetings for meetings' sake culture. Who's in one of those cultures? Or patient care that is end to end until people just fall down. Who's in one of those cultures? So there's no slow brain time in our current way of working. And there's no break, there's no way to like come up with anything new. And so, because we have most of how we think and most of how we solve problems on autopilot, 95% of our behavior is driven from our unconscious, we don't have escape velocity from our own thinking. We don't have an actual creative layer. And so I think there's a tendency in these large organizations to see people who have the luxury of being designers as freaks, or people who, oh, that's fun, but I have to do the real work, kind of thing. Yeah, go play your bongos, Rick says. So in order to normalize that, for me, I had to find a way of, again, I'm a scientist, and so I look at the science and I say, here, like I convinced a whole organization and the CMO, who was a cardiologist, that metabolic syndrome was a thing, but I did it with data. I did it with evidence that this is a conserved pattern within medicine. And I always start with conserved patterns of behavior. We call it in our field behaviors found in nature, because people do the same thing. Even if you put a device in front of them, they'll kind of relate to it in the same way, because again, there hasn't been enough time to evolve any other way to do it. So you can always find analogs within nature, within how people are behaving right now, that can help prove your point with senior leaders, with an organization, and help them to kind of, their heart wants to go with you, but their head has to check you out, right? So you're giving them some head food and say, here, it's legitimate, and you're making a case in that way. And I think in that sense, we have to be really good, science people, and we have to be really good artistic people.
Yeah, I mean, having leadership that is supportive doesn't hurt, right? Let's be honest. I've been in situations where leadership doesn't support this kind of thing, and I've been with Change Healthcare. We have a CEO who's extremely supportive of this direction, and so that is a very, very helpful thing. But regardless of whether you're kind of swimming upstream or kind of in the current that's already there and trying to develop something, start with your users. Get people who think they know their customers to interact with customers in a way that is unlike the way they typically do. If they're VOC people, have them interact through a design thinking empathy method. If they're salespeople, et cetera. I think sometimes the people that interact with customers already are the hardest ones to sort of retrain. It's kind of like if you've already learned to ski, learning to snowboard is actually harder, right, than if you've never learned to ski. So if you're already a customer person, you might need to unlearn some of what you know about trying to jump in with reasons or jump in with solutions or fixing things, right? A lot of the initial contact that we have through these processes is just about listening. It's interviewing in the truest sense of the word. We're only talking long enough to get them talking. And so that can be counter, I think, to a lot of the cultural roles that we've got inside of companies that are around sales or biz dev or account management. So be aware of where they're starting from, and but get them in front of customers in a way that that can give them some insight, I think, is always the way to start.
Go ahead.
So how do you engage your patients in an omnichannel environment? What technologies or solutions are you utilizing that to really reinforce an optimal experience for the patient? And sort of secondarily, are these technologies and solutions that you're leveraging enabling your staff to make that the most optimal environment for them as well. So is it a holistic solution?
So sorry, are you asking how do you get to them to get the research, or are you asking how do you engage it with them at different points?
So as consumers have approached and leveraging all channels, right, to engage a particular brand, but we're talking about healthcare. So as patients are utilizing, I mean, everyone has a smartphone, everyone
Yep.
has pretty much a tablet, and we've got phones and the web, et cetera. So how are you engaging the patient in that omni-channel environment? So as they might elect one particular channel over another, how are you reinforcing that and enabling them to leverage that preferred channel?
Right. So the first, I mean, unfortunately for many of us, current patients are not, that healthcare experience is very fragmented. And it really, I mean, I might have a preferred means of engaging with my healthcare system, but that will change depending on my context, right? So right now, my preference is to book an appointment with my doctor using my mobile device. I don't want to have to call anybody. I just want to say, here, this is what I need, a physical, this is what I need to do. However, if I'm in an acute situation, that's going to change drastically, and my primary paradigm or my primary mechanism is going to be vastly different. So I think what we need to do is understand that given a certain context and a certain environment, they're likely going to want to engage in a certain way. This will be their preferred channel, but recognize you have to support other methods as well, depending on what their experience is, depending on what, you know, what's happening. So just take a patient room, for example. A patient is in there, maybe it's an emergency situation, and they're not really thinking about their devices. Their primary means of engaging with them is through the hospital staff. So making sure that their experience is optimal through communication. And that's typically going to be, you know, one-on-one communication with the nurse or with the physician. And a side communication channel might be their device, or it could be a voice integrated system, right? I just want to note down questions that I want to ask the surgeon the next time he comes in and does rounds in the morning. And then also taking into account that they've likely got other family members or caregivers around them, and designing to their experience as well, because they're not with them 24/7. And so while the patient's primary mechanism might be that one-on-one verbal communication, the mother or the son or daughter of that patient is likely going to be relying on a digital or voice experience. And so making sure, again, you're designing those alternate channels to close that circle of care, right? So it's not just about the patient, because they might be incapacitated. So how am I going to support those caregivers?
One way to think of it, people get kind of fixated with omni-channel or multi-channel, that kind of a thing, but it gets down to distribution, right? Where is your user? Where is your customer? What is the context of where they are? And I would say that if you want to really do it properly or think about it properly, your minimum experience, right? Your sort of baseline experience that you design, whatever that is, should be agnostic of channel, meaning they're going to get the same, might be just delivered in a slightly different way, but they're going to get basically the same experience regardless of which channel they choose to interact with. But then your channel specificity, if you will, is the plus side, right? Take advantage of things you can do on top of that baseline experience because of the channel, right? Mobile phones have GPS trackers in them. You can do some interesting things with that, right? But you don't want to make that a part of your baseline experience, because then when they're not on a mobile phone, then they get a negative experience. So I would think of it as your baseline being agnostic of channel, and then building on top of that with things that you can do depending on the channel. But mobile phones, I mean, you know, it's almost silly that we continue to call them, you know, we talk about mobile, right? Nobody says the word color TV anymore, right? almost everyone has them depending on where you are. And there was a Forrester report, I think it was last year, that said that of smartphone owners, 97 to 98% of them have their phone within 3 feet of their body almost 24 hours a day, at the bedside, in their pocket, in their car, in the bathroom, right? So in some ways, the phone itself is an extension of the person in a very real way.
Okay, we'll take one more question and then we'll move on to the next category. Go ahead.
So healthcare traditionally has been very waterfall product development driven, especially on the regulated side of things. And the world outside has gone towards more lean innovation, and starting to see that in healthcare. Too many times I see in healthcare people shifting to go, let's go build it, for management pressure or time to market. From a UX perspective, could you talk maybe about some strategies about how it's so critical to first get customer validation, and before going into the build stage where you start to spend a lot of money and time and cycles? Any strategies or tools or suggestions?
I can go. First of all, Agile is a development methodology, not a design methodology. So be careful there. It's a fine methodology. It's great to use if you want to move fast on developing your product, building it. But for designing the product, it's not a replacement for those other methods. So be careful there. And in terms of lean, I think when I mentioned earlier needs, solutions, validation as sort of the 3 blocks of all of these methods. And I would say that things like design thinking, jobs to be done, outcome-driven innovation, these methods I think cover all 3 of those pretty well. Lean tends to focus a little more on the solution validation part, a little lighter on the needs part. In some ways it puts the needs third, meaning you develop a product, you put it in market, and that's when you find out whether it worked or not, right? So depending on what market you're in and the capabilities that you have to develop in code, that might be the right approach for you. But in my own kind of bias and the way I like to do things, I would say, unless you really are sure that you understand your customers' needs already, start with needs. Start with that understanding. Even if you need to do it quickly, even if you need to do it sort of down and dirty, guerrilla method, whatever it might be, don't start with building something if you can help it. Now that also means don't get into an analysis paralysis. On the contrary, right? Don't stare at your belly button so long that you never build something, right? That's also bad. But I would say think about kind of whatever culture you might be in, that getting to customer needs in a valid way is always, I think, the really important part. And Lean can work if you've already nailed that, but most people who are utilizing Lean have not, in my experience.
I would say that in my experience, the user is a moving target, the use case is a moving target, and so that's really hard for Agile to keep up with because of what you're saying, Rick, about the needs focus being less. So I'm a favor of making sure that you have some sort of lo-fi solution that moves with at least through 2 phases that the patient is going to go through. So for example, post-MI, first 4 weeks is a very different patient than 4 to 8 weeks. The crisis state and the sort of emotional spend from the brain starts to accommodate and desensitize. And what you had as a wake-up call is now a half-life of a sort of a rapidly decaying trace of a person trying to change their behavior or trying to go to rehab or whatever. And so, you have to know the dynamics of the herd movement that you're trying to follow and hold that in context. And I think the best way to do that is just to have these kind of behavioral tests of, does this make sense, and have it very, very highly manualized before you code it and before you actually decide on form factor and look and feel and those kinds of things.
We always do a gap analysis because, we're a consulting company, so we get people coming to us at different stages and recognizing that people aren't always starting in greenfield and they don't want to start from scratch. So, following a process where you can really identify what do we know, what do we don't know, and validate what do you think you know, and do that gap analysis. So we're still not just jumping right into design just because you think you know your users. We're clearly trying to push something forward. So let's figure out what do you know based on past work. Where are the gray areas? What you definitely don't know, and we start there from a user input validation perspective before going going into that design phase. So that's a critical part of starting every project, because again, if you don't do that, you're likely starting off from the wrong foot. And even if you just go to a low fidelity wireframe that you then validate, you're still likely going to have to recycle back. Iteration is good, but frankly, you think it's longer to start with research. It's not. It's going to shortcut some of that iterative validation processes later on.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for questions. Don't be shy. We're going to get into our second category. How do other industries leverage the user experience? And I think maybe we'll start with you, Lorraine. We haven't gone to you first. How do other industries measure the impact user experience has on their mission and their bottom line?
So I don't know that every industry does this, but certainly the complex ones, so such as finance, I think you can probably talk to that better than I. The aerospace or airline industry in particular, look at not just, I think too often companies focus on internal metrics, whereas the successful companies focus on what we call success metrics. And those are the customer-facing metrics that actually impact their bottom line. And so they're looking at things like success rates, obviously, customer satisfaction, adoption, and usage over time. Those are different. And then, of course, ease of use and error rates as well. So in the airline industry in particular, being able to perform a task with 0 errors, not minimal errors, just like healthcare, 0 errors has a definite impact on their bottom line, and so they track that very, very closely, as well as other things like efficiency and efficacy of doing certain things. So if I look at if you think about, everybody goes to the airport, and so often an announcement for a flight delay will come on. There's a mechanical problem where there's a whole process going on behind that simple announcement. We have a mechanical problem, and all of that is based on time to effectively identify, diagnose, and fix the problem, and fix it with 0 errors, because if there is an error that can be catastrophic. And so those are typically things that they're looking for, because they've uncovered that it does impact their bottom line. And one that we don't, that we often sort of view as a soft metric, and that's the experience, right? The customer experience or the patient experience, having a positive experience. Because, of course, if you have a bad experience, you're not going to come back.
The jet lag is kicking in. I had something to say. No, I was going to say, I think the other thing to think about is UX and UI is something people get mixed up quite a bit, right? And I think UX is really inclusive of that whole experience, right? The emotional part, the whole journey in and outside of digital screens, or et cetera. We jokingly sometimes say, the best UX is no UI. And in fact, that's often true. And if you look at disruptors, right, industries that have disrupted, like you mentioned the rideshare industry earlier. A lot of what they've done is to say, hey, how can we require as little as possible in terms of input and friction and effort from this user, from this customer, and still get them what it is they want, which is to get, to move from point A to point B. And so a lot of those, I remember the first time I ever used Uber, it was kind of crazy. I remember I got out of the car and said, wow, I almost feel like I'm getting away with something here. Like I don't have to sit there for 5 minutes and mess with the swiping machine and all of that. But I think the UX, starting with the UX is one way that disruptors tend to look at that, and then they say, how do we take care of all of the sort of duck paddling under the water stuff that has to happen to enable that experience that we've imagined?
I'm going to take a different tack on this, which is that I think the most successful user experiences right now are combining online and offline. And if you look at Facebook, for example, there was a time where they almost went to the Second Life fate, where you had this other world that you were living in and that kind of thing. But because they anchored back to offline experiences in your community, kind of the local newspaper kind of experiences, they were able to become a service and a utility that they wanted to become instead of just a fad of fakeness, up here. So I think the leveraging is really the sort of real world, follows you into every aspect of your being in the greatest sense of the diameter of combining online, offline. And that's kind of challenging for us as healthcare folks, because I had one of the most powerful things anybody ever said to me was this guy, he does like health philosophy, which I'm not really a philosophical mindset person. And he said, the heuristic in the brain of saying health is the same as saying death. And I was like, that seems true to me. So people are trying to avoid death, and so they avoid health. They avoid the word health. I stopped using the word health when it comes to interaction with people and user experience because of that reason, because I think we equate it in that sort of our demise kind of sense. And so we have unrealistic, I think, attempts. Somebody once said, if your brand isn't sexy, don't try to be sexy in your branding. And so similarly, let's be authentic. As a hospital, we take care of you when you're really sick and when stuff really goes downhill. And so let's embrace that. Let's not try to be a destination of fun or a destination of, the community or whatever. Those are kind of superficial. And so I think that what we see from other industries is that they're kind of true to themselves, in the user experience. And we're doing a lot with retail technology lately, and the sort of online, offline experience of, blending those two worlds. I can go into a store, I can click on a kiosk and I can get the thing sent here and I can pick it up later, or I can do it from my phone, or I can do it from home, or, it just kind of follows me everywhere. And I think that's kind of where we need to really think about, what's going to be online and what's going to be offline, and how do we design for both.
Thank you. I'm just going to be mindful of time. We've got about 8 or 10 minutes left, and we'll just dive right into some more healthcare-specific questions. Why don't we start with this one? How does the intimate emotional component of sickness or wellness affect the healthcare consumer experience? Who'd like to dive in first? Kyra? Yeah.
Okay.
You just said it.
Yes.
Yes.
Health equals death.
Yeah.
Okay, we got it.
So the way I think about the brain is is anybody old enough like me that in science in school you were taught that the electron goes around in a flat orbit from the nucleus? Anybody remember that concept? All right. So then there's this whole idea of electron cloud, right? Which is this three-dimensional what do we do with that? The electron could be anywhere. It's over here. It's over there. It could be anywhere. And that's kind of how the brain is. If you're ill, you're on one side of your cloud, meaning certain things are important to you, and then when you're well, you're on the other side of the cloud. And what's consistent, though, I find across ill and well, are a couple things, which is the self-image. The self-image is the most stable area of the brain. Rumination area, it's the kind of the story of, in my case, the story of Kyra, or the story of fill in your name right now, who I think I am, who I think I'm not. Every single behavior that you do is cogent with your self-image. Everything you're wearing right now passed the me, not me test, right? So we can say, okay, whether somebody's ill or somebody's well, we know that their self-image is conserved, They're always going to want to be smart. They're always going to want to be able. They're always going to want to be, better than average. Those are the things that get us up out of bed in the morning. If we didn't think that about ourselves, we would give up, right? So those are some what I call weight-bearing assumptions that you can use and that you can leverage to create and anticipate what somebody might want or need in that case. And when wearables first came out, everybody was super excited and thought that and then of course there was the kind of bad gossip of it only lasts 3 weeks and then it's in the drawer and stuff like that, and really, really harping on. Now we're seeing kind of an upsurge where, Fitbit at least has kind of, morphed in what it focuses on. And it feeds back, you know, this self-image of I am good by having a lifetime counter where you're getting credit, right? So they switched gears of I'm getting better and better and better and better and better. That was like a short-term burnout path, right? Now they're like, I'm a good person because I've banked all of this like good behavior and you're my mirror for my good personness, right? So they became more valuable, they pivoted and became more addictive by doing that shift. You guys see that? So everything in the self-image can be definitely leveraged to create a great experience, regardless of health.
No, I really like that because that goes to the question I was asked earlier about, well, how do I know who my user is? Well, it sounds like there's sort of a universal baseline for being a human being, right, that you've described. That's interesting, yeah.
Okay. What are some examples of organizations across the healthcare continuum that really get it? They really get user experience. What are they doing that others aren't? Who wants to dive in?
So the ones that are really successful are the ones that are taking into account everything that we've talked about, right? And I'd say the main ones are absolutely designing to the emotional needs and not just, you know, the checklist that everybody thinks about. Designing for across the continuum of care, right? So getting rid of that fractured experience. So don't just design for those little points in time, but design for the end-to-end journey. And I had a third one which just dropped from my brain. But I mean, so the most successful ones are, I think, taking some of what we've done in the consumer world and applying it to healthcare, right? Because in the consumer world, designing for a frictionless experience has been the sort of, you know, golden chalice, and I think that is equally, if not even more important in healthcare. Everybody expects that make it easy button. Remember that commercial, make it easy button? And even though healthcare is complex, I think people, to certain degrees, come to solutions within healthcare with those expectations, and you can't ignore that. Of course, you need to mitigate for certain risks and ensure patient safety, but do that in the easiest way possible, and that means designing for those users in particular, and making sure that they stay at the center of that design process. So Jawbone is a good example. Fitbit, we've heard of. Jawbone is actually moving more into the clinical space, and they're trying to leverage what they've been doing on the clinical side versus the consumer health, what I'd call consumer health side, that Fitbit has been focusing on. But it's really leveraging you know, what they have and providing not just easy experiences, but meaningful experiences as well. So, I mean, going back to your comment about everybody joked, you know, you wore it for 3 weeks and throw it in the drawer. And I'd argue, you know, part of it, obviously, Kyra made a great case for here's why that happened, but also they just weren't delivering anything that people didn't already know, right? So you can't just, you know, design a frictionless experience. You have to deliver meaning on top of that. So that means making that emotional connection through whatever you're doing, but also making sure that people are getting value out of it. What am I learning from this? How can I help myself? Making sure you're delivering to those.
And Lorraine, you said something really interesting about expectation setting, right? And this is something I think everybody needs to really almost have taped to their bathroom mirror, right? I used to get, when I ran UX for B of A and JP Morgan and those kind of companies, financial companies often say, well, what are other banks doing? Yeah. Right? And in healthcare, we probably say, well, what are the other healthcare companies doing? Well, here's a newsflash. It doesn't matter. What really matters is what are all the other experiences your end customers are having in their daily lives, and what's really happening is they've all got a smartphone, they've probably got a Facebook account, they're using Google. There may be driving a Tesla, there may be driving in an Uber, right? So these experiences are forming their holistic expectations about the world. And even if you're in the B2B software world, right, those people are having consumer digital experiences every day that are exceeding their expectations. So it's not, I believe that even B2B software has to go through a consumerization because their expectation set is now based on their entire lives, and their entire lives are digital.
And to be quite honest, the newer companies coming up in healthcare that are centered around that remote health monitoring are really taking an innovative look at how they design experiences, because we talked about how, well, sometimes an experience it lacks a UI, and that's great, right? So if we think about the Echo, for instance, you know, if I'm in the home and I'm elderly, I don't necessarily want or would, my first instinct is not to go and pick up my mobile phone or my tablet or go to my desktop. I might just want to say something and have something happen, right? Or have something talk to me to remind me I need to take medication, or did I do my exercises today? So that doesn't have a UI, but you're delivering a lot of meaning and value to the end user.
So I would say, I think it's almost like asking which Olympic athlete I like the best, because they're in different sports. So I would say in the division of caregiving, I really was blown away by Honor. First of all, they get the prize for best name of company, because that's a really, you know, it's hard to play in the caregiving space and not be patronizing to anybody and disrespectful to anybody, but still get your point across. And I love the sort of online-offline mix. That they did it in a way that most caregiving apps have this kind of bent towards either being asking too much of the senior user, which they do not want to do because of the generation technology they come from, or having this creepy feature of like your adult children are watching you, you know, kind of thing. And so this is kind of a great medium in between, where there's this caregiver that's deployed. It's a mental model, you know, to your point, Rick, about, you know, leveraging the care.com model and those kinds of things, where you're deploying somebody, but you're also kind of involved in monitoring the situation. The other one I love is 7 Cups of Tea. And they are kind of democratizing, if you will, mental health. You know, basically saying that just give somebody a listener and a person who's skilled in listening, who's been trained in listening, and you can have a synchronous sort of relief pill right now digitally, where somebody can just, you know, be listening to somebody else. And it's this kind of shared economy. It also creates a sense of like, I'm filling an important role for somebody else. I'm giving back, which is often what people want to do. We don't want to be seen as our weakest self. We want to be seen as a strong giver. Who feels better about giving than receiving, right? It's a position of strength that we're used to. And so it honors somebody who's also needing help to give help back, and it creates this kind of cyclical thing. Beautiful design, social, emotional design, as well as they've got all the sort of, you know, boxes checked on UX and UI.
Thank you, and what a great way to wrap up our opening keynote for the HIMSS17 User Experience Forum. I'd like us all to recognize and give a great round of applause for Kyra and Rick and Lorraine. Thank you so very much.